Why are you even mad? We're not married, she said while rolling her eyes like I was some clingy roommate instead of her boyfriend of 3 years. The words hit me harder than any argument we'd ever had, cutting through whatever hope I still carried that we could work through this rough patch. I stood there in our shared living room, watching Morgan check her phone for what felt like the 100th time that evening, and something inside me just went quiet and still. The dismissive tone in her voice told me everything I needed to know about how little our relationship actually meant to her. I'd been trying to address what everyone could see except her, the late nights at work that stretched past midnight, the sudden interest in expensive restaurants I'd never heard of, the way she'd started dressing differently and coming home smelling like cologne that definitely wasn't mine. As a database systems administrator, I'm used to identifying patterns and anomalies in complex systems, and Morgan's behavior had been throwing up error codes for months. When I finally worked up the courage to ask her directly about Zane, this coworker from her boutique marketing firm who seemed to feature in every story lately, she dismissed my concerns like I was being paranoid and possessive. She accused me of not trusting her, of being jealous of her success at work, of trying to control her social life just because I preferred quiet evenings at home to whatever networking events and happy hours consumed her schedule. The conversation escalated when I mentioned that we barely spent time together anymore, that she seemed distracted and distant whenever we were in the same room, that I felt like I was sharing an apartment with a stranger who happened to look like my girlfriend. That's when she delivered that line about marriage, as if our 3 years together meant nothing because we hadn't signed a legal document. Instead of arguing back or demanding explanations, I walked to our bedroom and started packing my clothes into the same duffel bag I'd brought when we first moved in together. Morgan followed me, suddenly concerned about my silence, asking what I was doing and insisting she hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I told her she was absolutely right, we weren't married, which meant I was free to leave whenever I wanted, just like she was apparently free to do whatever she'd been doing with Zane. While she protested and tried to backtrack, claiming she was just stressed about work and hadn't been thinking clearly, I methodically gathered my belongings, my laptop, my books, the few pieces of furniture that were actually mine. The whole time, her phone kept buzzing with messages, and I caught glimpses of Zane's name on the screen each time she glanced at it. She kept insisting we could work this out, that I was overreacting, that she needed space to figure things out but didn't want me to leave. After I loaded my car with the essentials, I did what any good systems administrator does when investigating suspicious activity. I checked the digital trail. A quick scroll through social media while sitting in my car outside our apartment revealed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to admit. Photos of Morgan and Zane at events I'd never been invited to, restaurant check-ins during nights she'd claimed to be working late on urgent projects, comments between them that carried an intimacy I recognized from our early relationship. There were group photos from marketing team outings where they stood closer than colleagues should, tagged locations at upscale bars during supposed overtime sessions, even a few pictures from what looked like weekend trips I'd never heard about. The timeline was clear once I stopped making excuses for her. This had been going on for at least 3 months, maybe longer. I drove to my brother's place in the suburbs that night, leaving behind the apartment we'd shared and the future I'd thought we were building together, carrying nothing but my belongings and the clarity that comes from finally seeing a situation for exactly what it is. I met Morgan 2 years earlier during a Saturday morning volunteer shift at the Community Literacy Center, where she was helping organize reading materials while I set up their new computer system for tracking student progress. She had this genuine enthusiasm when talking about education reform and her dream of starting a nonprofit to provide learning resources in underserved communities, speaking passionately about the impact we could make if we just organized our efforts properly. I was immediately drawn to her combination of idealism and practical thinking, the way she'd mapped out detailed plans for her future organization while still rolling up her sleeves to sort donated books. At the time, she worked at a boutique marketing firm handling social media accounts for local businesses, but she made it clear this was temporary, just a way to build professional skills and save money while she pursued her nonprofit certification courses and built connections in the education sector. Those early conversations revealed someone who shared my belief in steady progress and meaningful work, even if her path looked different from my structured career in database administration. When we moved in together after 8 months of dating, I was happy to support her nonprofit ambitions by covering the larger share of our apartment expenses while she focused on her continuing education courses and volunteer commitments. My salary as a database systems administrator was stable enough to handle most of our rent and utilities, and I genuinely believed we were investing in our shared future when she used the money she saved to attend weekend seminars on grant writing and nonprofit management. Morgan would come home from these workshops energized and full of ideas, spreading course materials across our kitchen table while she planned curriculum frameworks and budget projections for the learning center she wanted to establish. I'd help her organize her notes into digital files and create simple databases to track her research, feeling like we were building something important together. Those were some of our happiest months, quiet weeknights spent working on our respective projects while sharing takeout, weekend mornings at farmers markets followed by volunteer shifts, conversations about the kind of impact her nonprofit could have on local literacy rates and educational outcomes. The shift began gradually after Morgan got assigned to work more closely with Zane on a major client account about 18 months into our relationship. Zane had joined the marketing firm 6 months earlier with an impressive background in corporate consulting and connections throughout the city's business community, bringing what Morgan described as a fresh perspective on client relationships and strategic growth. She started mentioning him more frequently in her work stories, how he'd suggested innovative approaches to social media campaigns, how he'd introduced her to networking events where she could meet potential donors for her future nonprofit, how he understood the importance of building a professional image in ways her previous colleagues didn't. I initially supported these developments, thinking the connections and experience would benefit her nonprofit goals, but I began noticing subtle changes in her priorities and communication patterns. The weekend seminars became less frequent, replaced by after-work networking events and client dinners that often ran past midnight, and our kitchen table conversations shifted from nonprofit planning to discussions about personal branding and career advancement strategies in the marketing world. The weekend trips started about 3 months before our final confrontation, always framed as essential team-building exercises or client entertainment opportunities that Zane had recommended for advancing her position at the firm. Morgan would return from these trips energized but distant, full of stories about exclusive restaurants and professional development insights that somehow never translated into concrete progress on her nonprofit plans. When I asked about her certification courses or grant writing workshops, she'd become vague and defensive, explaining that Zane had convinced her to focus on building industry credibility first before launching her nonprofit venture. The money I'd been giving her for continuing education started going toward what she called networking investments, professional wardrobe updates, expensive dinners with potential contacts, weekend conferences that seemed more focused on lifestyle experiences than educational content. I trusted her judgment and continued providing financial support, believing these networking efforts would eventually benefit her nonprofit work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her fundamental goals were shifting in ways she wasn't fully acknowledging to herself or to me. The final confrontation began when I discovered a series of charges on our shared credit card that Morgan had never mentioned, expensive dinners at upscale restaurants during weeknights when she claimed to be working late, hotel charges from weekend trips I knew nothing about, purchases at high-end boutiques that didn't align with her usual shopping habits. When I brought up these unexplained expenses, she became immediately defensive, accusing me of monitoring her spending like some controlling parent instead of a supportive partner. She explained that Zane had been teaching her about the importance of professional image in the marketing world, how successful people invest in experiences and relationships rather than just saving money in boring accounts like I preferred to do. According to her, these dinners and trips were essential networking opportunities that would eventually pay dividends when she launched her nonprofit, and my focus on budgets and financial planning showed that I didn't understand how real business relationships actually worked in competitive industries. I tried explaining that I wasn't opposed to professional development expenses, but I needed transparency about how our money was being used, especially when it meant putting charges on credit cards without discussing them first. That's when Morgan revealed what had really been developing over the past few months, her growing conviction that Zane represented everything she'd been missing in terms of ambition and professional vision. She described how he'd shown her a completely different approach to career advancement, one focused on making connections with influential people and positioning herself in circles where real opportunities emerged naturally. While I spent my evenings working on database projects and reading technical manuals, Zane was introducing her to entrepreneurs and business leaders who could potentially fund her future nonprofit or offer her positions with established organizations that already had the resources she'd been dreaming about building from scratch. The conversation escalated when she accused me of holding her back with my preference for careful planning and incremental progress, claiming that people like Zane understood the importance of taking calculated risks and seizing opportunities when they presented themselves. She said that watching me approach every decision through spreadsheets and risk analysis had made her realize how limited her own thinking had become, how she'd started settling for small goals because that's what felt safe in our relationship. When I pointed out that careful planning had allowed me to support her nonprofit education and cover our living expenses while she pursued her dreams, she dismissed this as me trying to control her through financial dependency rather than genuinely supporting her aspirations. The argument reached its breaking point when she admitted that she'd been questioning whether our entire relationship was built on fundamentally incompatible approaches to life and success. That's when she delivered the line about marriage, suggesting that I was taking our relationship more seriously than the situation warranted given that we hadn't made any legal commitments to each other. She said that successful people like Zane understand the difference between serious partnerships and casual relationships, and maybe we'd been confusing our comfortable living arrangement with something more significant than it actually was. Her dismissive tone when she said this made it clear that she'd already mentally moved on from whatever we'd built together, and I realized that arguing further would only give her more opportunities to justify decisions she'd apparently already made. Instead of trying to convince her otherwise or demanding explanations about her relationship with Zane, I simply agreed with her assessment of our unmarried status and began packing my belongings while she left to meet Zane at what she described as an exclusive networking event downtown that would be important for her career development. While I was settling into my brother's guest room and trying to rebuild my routine, Morgan was discovering what life with Zane actually looked like beyond the impressive facade he'd presented during their workplace flirtation. I learned about her situation months later through mutual friends, but the timeline of events painted a clear picture of how quickly her exciting new relationship deteriorated once she was fully dependent on Zane's promises and lifestyle choices. Within 2 weeks of my departure, she'd moved into his upscale downtown apartment, believing she was finally experiencing the kind of sophisticated urban life she'd been craving while stuck in our modest suburban place with someone who preferred quiet evenings and careful budgeting over spontaneous adventures and networking opportunities. The reality behind Zane's impressive lifestyle became apparent almost immediately after Morgan moved in with him. His expensive apartment was leased far beyond his actual means, funded by maxed-out credit cards and personal loans he'd been juggling for months while maintaining the appearance of professional success. The networking events and exclusive restaurants that had seemed so glamorous during their secret relationship turned out to be desperate attempts to maintain connections with potential clients and investors who might help him avoid the financial collapse that was already inevitable when Morgan entered his life. She discovered that his confident charm masked a manipulative personality that emerged whenever he felt pressured about money or questioned about his business practices, leading to emotional outbursts and gaslighting sessions where he'd convince her that her concerns about their mounting expenses were signs of small-minded thinking that would hold both of them back from achieving real success. The marketing firm where they both worked became increasingly uncomfortable as Zane's behavior grew more erratic and his client relationships started deteriorating due to missed deadlines and questionable billing practices. Morgan found herself covering for his mistakes and making excuses to their colleagues for his frequent absences, gradually realizing that his reputation for innovative strategies was actually based on cutting corners and overpromising results he couldn't deliver. When she tried to distance herself from his professional problems, he'd accuse her of being disloyal and ungrateful for the opportunities he'd provided, reminding her that she'd chosen to leave her stable relationship for the excitement and advancement he offered. The emotional manipulation intensified as his financial situation worsened, with Zane alternating between lavish gestures funded by credit cards and angry confrontations where he'd blame Morgan for not contributing enough to their shared lifestyle or understanding the pressures he faced maintaining their social status. The situation exploded when Morgan accidentally discovered bank statements and client communications that revealed Zane had been embezzling funds from their marketing firm to finance his lifestyle and cover his accumulated debt. The scheme involved overcharging clients for services, creating fake expenses for reimbursement, and manipulating project budgets to skim money that should have gone toward actual campaign costs. When she confronted him about the evidence she'd found, he initially tried to convince her that these were standard business practices in competitive industries, then shifted to threatening her with professional destruction if she reported his activities to their supervisors or anyone outside their relationship. The threats escalated to include claims that he'd destroy her reputation in the marketing industry and ensure she'd never find decent employment if she betrayed him, while simultaneously promising that his schemes would eventually pay off and provide them with the financial security she'd always wanted. Morgan's situation became untenable when the firm's financial audit discovered Zane's embezzlement scheme, leading to his immediate termination and criminal investigation that threatened to implicate anyone who'd been aware of his activities. Rather than face the legal consequences and professional destruction that would result from staying to answer questions about what she knew and when she knew it, Zane disappeared one weekend, leaving Morgan to face angry clients, suspicious colleagues, and potential criminal charges related to money he'd stolen while they were living together. She lost her job within days of the investigation's launch, with the firm citing concerns about her association with Zane's fraudulent activities and their inability to trust that she hadn't been involved in or aware of his schemes throughout their relationship. 6 months after leaving our shared apartment, I made the decision to relocate to Richmond after receiving a job offer from a tech consulting firm that specialized in database solutions for healthcare organizations. The position represented a significant step forward in my career, better salary, more responsibility, and the opportunity to work on systems that actually improved patient outcomes rather than just optimizing business processes. The move felt like the fresh start I needed, putting physical distance between myself and the memories of my relationship with Morgan while positioning myself in a city where I could build something entirely new. I found a comfortable one-bedroom apartment near downtown Richmond, close enough to walk to work but quiet enough to maintain the peaceful routine I'd always preferred over the chaotic social scene that had ultimately consumed Morgan's attention and priorities. The tech consulting firm turned out to be an ideal environment for someone with my background and work style, with colleagues who appreciated methodical problem-solving and clients who valued reliable, well-documented solutions over flashy presentations and networking theatrics. Within 3 months, I was assigned to lead a project upgrading the patient records system for a network of community health clinics, work that felt meaningful in ways my previous corporate database projects never had. The technical challenges were engaging without being overwhelming, and I found myself genuinely excited about going to work each day, something I'd forgotten was possible during those final months of watching Morgan become increasingly dissatisfied with our quiet, stable life together. My supervisor mentioned that my attention to detail and ability to explain complex systems in simple terms made me a natural fit for their training programs, suggesting I consider teaching evening classes at the local community college to help other professionals develop database skills. The teaching opportunity at Richmond Community College introduced me to a completely different side of my professional abilities, as I discovered that I genuinely enjoyed helping students understand the logical frameworks behind database design and management. The evening classes attracted a diverse group of working adults, nurses seeking to advance into healthcare administration, small business owners wanting to better organize their customer information, career changers looking to enter the growing field of data analysis. Among these students was Lily, a nursing student who was taking the database course to prepare for a position in clinical research coordination, someone who approached learning with the same methodical persistence I'd always valued in my own work. She had this way of asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated she was thinking beyond the immediate assignment to understand how these skills would apply in real-world healthcare settings, and I found myself looking forward to our brief conversations after class about her progress and career goals. Lily and I began studying together at a coffee shop near campus after she mentioned struggling with some of the more complex database relationship concepts, meetings that gradually evolved into longer conversations about our respective career paths and experiences in the healthcare field. She appreciated my patient approach to explaining difficult concepts, while I was impressed by her dedication to improving patient care through better organization of medical information and research data. Our study sessions expanded beyond database coursework to include volunteer work at a free clinic where she was completing her community service requirements and where they needed someone to help organize their patient tracking systems pro bono. Working together on this project showed me how different a relationship could feel when both people were genuinely supportive of each other's goals rather than competing for attention or resources, and I realized how much I'd been missing during those final months with Morgan when every conversation became an argument about priorities and lifestyle choices. The contrast between Morgan's criticism of my supposedly boring stability and Lily's appreciation of my reliability helped me understand that I hadn't been the problem in my previous relationship, just incompatible with someone whose values had shifted towards superficial excitement over genuine partnership. Lily would get excited when I showed her efficient ways to organize complex data sets, while Morgan had rolled her eyes at my systematic approach to planning our finances and future goals. Where Morgan had seen my preference for quiet evenings as a lack of ambition, Lily saw someone who was thoughtful about how he spent his time and energy, someone who found satisfaction in meaningful work rather than constant social stimulation. I started therapy during this period to better understand why I'd tolerated Morgan's increasingly dismissive treatment for so long, learning to recognize my own worth and establish healthier boundaries in relationships rather than assuming I needed to change fundamental aspects of my personality to keep someone interested. The Richmond community welcomed me in ways I hadn't expected, as I joined a local astronomy club that met monthly for stargazing sessions in nearby state parks, pursuing a hobby I'd abandoned during my relationship with Morgan because she found it boring and antisocial. Through the astronomy club, I met other professionals who shared similar interests in science and systematic observation, people who appreciated the patience required to properly use telescopes and the satisfaction of understanding complex celestial mechanics. These friendships developed naturally around shared activities rather than networking obligations or social status considerations, reminding me what genuine connections felt like when they weren't built on manipulation or competing agendas. While I was building a new life in Richmond, Morgan was struggling to recover from the collapse of her relationship with Zane and the professional destruction that followed his embezzlement scandal. Through mutual friends who occasionally updated me despite my requests not to hear about her situation, I learned that she'd been essentially blacklisted from marketing firms throughout our original city due to her association with Zane's fraudulent activities. The professional network she'd been so excited to join through his connections had turned against her once the criminal investigation revealed the extent of his financial crimes, leaving her unable to secure employment in the field where she'd claimed to be building her future. Her dreams of launching a nonprofit had been abandoned completely as she faced the immediate challenge of finding any legitimate work that would pay enough to cover basic living expenses without the financial support I'd provided during our relationship. The first few months after Zane's disappearance found Morgan bouncing between the couches of various friends who gradually lost patience with her inability to take responsibility for the choices that had led to her current situation. She'd apparently developed a narrative where she'd been the victim of Zane's manipulation rather than acknowledging her role in abandoning our relationship and her original goals for the sake of what she'd perceived as a more exciting opportunity. This victim mentality made it difficult for her to maintain friendships with people who remembered how dismissive she'd been of my support and how eager she'd been to embrace Zane's lifestyle even after obvious warning signs about his character and business practices. Her social media presence during this period alternated between vague posts about learning from difficult experiences and more pointed content about toxic people who take advantage of others' trust and generosity. The situation became more desperate when Morgan realized that her professional reputation had been damaged beyond simple job searching, requiring her to completely reinvent her career approach if she wanted to achieve any kind of financial stability. Through a combination of unemployment benefits and part-time retail work, she was barely covering rent for a studio apartment in a less desirable part of town, a dramatic downgrade from the lifestyle she'd enjoyed while Zane was funding their expensive habits with stolen money. The contrast between her current circumstances and the comfortable life we'd shared became increasingly apparent as she struggled with basic expenses that had never been concerns when I was covering the majority of our household costs and supporting her nonprofit education goals. Around 8 months after our breakup, Morgan apparently became obsessed with the idea that reconciling with me would solve her financial and professional problems, launching an elaborate campaign to demonstrate her personal growth and renewed commitment to her original nonprofit aspirations. Her social media accounts suddenly featured photos of her volunteering at various organizations, posts about online courses in nonprofit management, and inspirational content about learning from mistakes and focusing on meaningful goals rather than superficial success. The timing and obvious calculation behind this image rehabilitation effort suggested that someone had advised her to rebuild her reputation through documented community service and educational achievements, though the activities seemed more focused on creating convincing social media content than genuine engagement with nonprofit work. When her indirect social media approach failed to generate any response from me, Morgan escalated to enlisting mutual friends and even my family members as intermediaries, sharing carefully crafted stories about how Zane had manipulated her and destroyed her life while expressing regret about not appreciating the stability and support I'd provided. She apparently told these third parties that she'd been naive about Zane's character and had realized too late that she'd thrown away something real for someone who was using her to maintain his criminal lifestyle, positioning herself as someone who'd learned valuable lessons about recognizing genuine partnership versus superficial attraction. The friends who passed along these messages seemed genuinely concerned about her situation, but they also acknowledged that her version of events minimized her own agency in choosing to pursue Zane despite clear signs that he was leading her away from her stated goals and values. The most concerning escalation came when Morgan hired a private investigator to track down my new address in Richmond, using information from social media detective work and professional networking sites to piece together details about my relocation and career advancement. She'd apparently discovered through online research that I was thriving in my new position and seemed to be building a successful life, triggering an obsessive conviction that winning me back would restore both her financial security and her sense of self-worth. Her plan involved traveling to Richmond for what she described to friends as a grand gesture that would demonstrate her transformation and commitment to rebuilding the life we'd originally planned together, showing that she'd learned to value the qualities she'd previously dismissed as boring and unambitious. 3 years after that night when Morgan told me we weren't married, I was attending my company's annual charity fundraiser as one of the featured speakers, having been invited to present on the database systems we developed for local nonprofit organizations and the measurable impact these tools had on their service delivery capabilities. The event was being held at Richmond's historic Jefferson Hotel, with representatives from healthcare organizations, educational nonprofits, and community service agencies gathering to celebrate collaborative projects and discuss future technology partnerships. I was genuinely excited to be there, not because of any social networking opportunities, but because the work we'd accomplished had helped these organizations serve more people more efficiently, creating real value rather than just impressive presentations or profit margins. My presentation focused on a patient tracking system we developed for a network of free clinics, demonstrating how proper database design had reduced appointment scheduling errors by 60% and improved medication tracking accuracy for low-income patients who often struggled to maintain consistent healthcare records. The audience included board members from various nonprofits who were considering similar technology upgrades, and I found myself energized by their thoughtful questions about implementation costs and staff training requirements. This was exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd always imagined doing, using technical skills to support organizations that were actually improving people's lives rather than just maximizing revenue or market share. After my presentation, I was mingling with attendees and discussing potential future projects when Lily approached with 2 glasses of wine and her characteristic smile that always made me feel like I was exactly where I belonged. She'd attended the event as a representative of the clinical research department where she now worked as a coordination specialist, and she'd been networking with other healthcare professionals about data management best practices in medical research. We'd been engaged for 6 months at that point, having developed a relationship built on genuine mutual support and shared values rather than financial dependency or social status considerations. And seeing her in this professional setting reminded me how much I appreciated being with someone who was pursuing her own meaningful career goals. I was telling Lily about a potential collaboration with a literacy nonprofit when I noticed a familiar figure approaching from across the hotel ballroom, moving through the crowd with determined purpose and an expression I remembered from our most difficult conversations. Morgan had somehow gained entry to this private professional event and was walking directly toward us, dressed in an outfit that looked like she'd researched appropriate attire for non-profit fundraising events and carrying herself with the kind of forced confidence that suggested she'd rehearsed this encounter extensively. My first instinct was to create distance, but we were surrounded by colleagues and potential clients, making any dramatic exit inappropriate for the professional setting. Morgan reached our conversation circle and immediately launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about personal growth, professional redemption, and her renewed commitment to nonprofit work, speaking as if she'd been invited to address the group rather than interrupting a private conversation between people who had no interest in hearing from her. She talked about learning valuable lessons from her mistakes, about recognizing the difference between superficial success and meaningful work, about how her recent volunteer experiences had reminded her of her original passion for education and community service. The entire presentation felt calculated to demonstrate her transformation and suitability for returning to the life we'd once planned together, delivered with the kind of polished confidence that suggested she'd practiced these talking points extensively. The most painful moment came when Morgan finally acknowledged my presence directly, expressing how proud she was to see that I'd achieved the kind of meaningful career success we'd always discussed, how she'd always known I had the potential to make a real difference through my technical skills and dedication to helping others. She spoke as if we'd simply drifted apart due to timing and circumstances rather than her deliberate choice to abandon our relationship for someone who offered more excitement and social status, rewriting our history to position herself as someone who'd always supported my goals and values. Her tone suggested that she expected this professional setting and her demonstrated growth to override the hurt she'd caused, as if her presence at a non-profit fundraiser somehow proved she'd returned to being the person I'd originally fallen in love with. The devastating realization hit Morgan when she noticed the engagement ring on Lily's finger and I introduced Lily as my fiancée, making it clear that I hadn't been waiting around hoping for her return but had instead built a complete new life with someone who actually appreciated the qualities she dismissed as inadequate. The calculated confidence in her prepared speech crumbled as she processed the reality that the stable, planning-oriented man she'd rejected for being too boring had found someone who valued exactly those characteristics she'd criticized. I watched her face as she understood that I hadn't just moved on romantically, but had achieved the kind of professional recognition and meaningful career impact she'd claimed I was too unambitious to accomplish. Lily handled the encounter with the kind of graceful professionalism that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her, acknowledging Morgan politely while making it clear that she wasn't intimidated or threatened by the appearance of my ex-girlfriend at our professional event. When Morgan attempted to extend the conversation by asking about our relationship and wedding plans, Lily smoothly redirected the discussion back to the nonprofit work that had originally brought us to this fundraiser, effectively ending Morgan's opportunity to create the dramatic reconciliation scene she'd apparently planned. The contrast between Morgan's desperate manipulation tactics and Lily's confident authenticity made it clear to everyone in our conversation circle exactly what kind of person I'd chosen to build my future with. As Morgan finally retreated from our group, clearly understanding that her grand gesture had failed completely, I felt a profound sense of gratitude rather than vindication, thankful that her painful dismissal 3 years earlier had ultimately freed me to find someone who celebrated rather than criticized my authentic self. Lily and I spent the rest of the evening discussing our upcoming wedding plans and the volunteer work we wanted to expand together, representing the kind of genuine partnership Morgan had rejected in favor of superficial excitement that ultimately proved to be built on fraud and manipulation. The man she'd called too boring and unambitious had found both professional success and personal happiness with someone who understood that real love means supporting each other's goals rather than competing for social status or financial advantages.